Well, look, it's not to take any wind away from the new excitement and flavor of optimism coming out of the Trump White House, and I'm not trying to be anti-Trump. I'm cynical about politics in general. I have to caveat that, left or right. I wrote an article exactly 2 years ago called The ABCs of CBDC. I said, beware of technical innovations being the cure-all, just like human innovations, there's not a cure-all. And politics, tech, AI, they're all kind of wolves in sheep's clothing. In terms of the specific question about having an executive order with a nice signature and a camera in front, we're not going to go down the CBDC route of programmable, seizable, controllable digital money. We're not going to do that. That's optically fantastic. Say that with the executive order in your left hand, but what's happening with the right hand, whether Trump's aware of it or not? We're making a massive effort in the digitalization and tokenization of all things through the Ripple XRP railway of all things digital and tokenable and ISO compliance, ISO 222, blockchain compatibility, all this tech that's going on. As you're publicly decrying CBDC with your left hand, you're rolling out a bigger play with Tether in your right hand and stablecoins. And stablecoins, to me, and Tether in particular, is just CBDC by another name. It's not issued by a central bank or the two-tier banking system. It's introduced by the libertarian liberals of Silicon Valley and the highly integrated DC military industrial complex, DC political complex, which is so techie confusing intentionally that you can mock and get rid of the CBDC headlines by saying we're never going down that route, while at the same time you're rolling out the XRP highway, the digital highway, and in particular the Tether highway. Tether is only just beginning, and XRP and these other things are only just beginning. They've been in play long before Bitcoin came out. I think that's creepy that the same NSA, Intel organizations that rolled out Ripple and the digital highway before Bitcoin was rolled out have also rolled out stable coins. And there is a direct connection between Bitcoin and Tether. There is a direct connection between the digitalization of all things and the centralization of all things. But again, Tether is a CBDC. Right now, it's only 0.5% of publicly held debt in it, but the idea is to create a balloon in Bitcoin deliberately. And the idea is to attract attention and interest in stablecoins in general and Tether in particular, because it's just one more source. Tether is backed largely primarily by US Treasuries. It's one more way to mop up otherwise unloved, weaponized, unwanted US IOUs, US Treasuries. And again, it's only 5% of publicly held US debt, but as Tether gets bigger, it takes the pressure off the Fed to have to print money to buy those treasuries. You can have the public do it for you by creating a balloon in digital memes, digital headlines, the digitalization of all things, create a meme and a balloon and headlines in Bitcoin, which is also a complete contradiction to the White House 3 years ago or Trump 3 years ago. Desperate times require desperate measures, and it ties into the Bitcoin discussion. I'm not trying to lead this away from Bitcoin, but it's all part of the digitalization, the tokenization of all things. And I've written a report on our Why Gold page about is Bitcoin a better investment than gold? When you talk about gold and crypto, you think if you're a gold executive that you have to just mock crypto in general or Bitcoin in particular. I'm not one of those guys. You have to take Bitcoin very seriously, not just as a rising market cap and rising asset, but a politicized asset right now. We have to take that seriously. But I always start the conversation with, and this sounds tinfoil hatted, but who or what really created Bitcoin? And I know that sounds like a conspiracy theory. 70% of the Bitcoin market share is eerily static, and we really don't know who holds it and how they've held it and never sold it for so long. They seem to have tremendous confidence. When countries are desperate and they're broken and their markets are at risk and their currencies are at risk and inflation is a headline and social unrest comes from that, which is all around us, you get more and more centralization. That's throughout history always the case, from the extreme left or the extreme right. You have to look at what I call the Voorhees or the Trump paradox. Remember, Eric Voorhees, big pro-Bitcoin. What does he see? He pounds his fist. I chose Bitcoin because it's decentralized, it's apolitical, it's out of the political swamp, it's out of the banking system. And yet, you couldn't be more centralized now with Bitcoin ETFs out of Larry Fink, who 3 years ago hated Bitcoin. Now he's got a $50 billion Bitcoin ETF. And you couldn't get more centralized when you have a White House talking about strategic Bitcoin reserve. This is from a president who 3 years ago said Bitcoin was a scam. Why the change? Why is Trump threatening 100% tariffs against the BRICS for going away from the mighty dollar when the entire central thesis of Bitcoin is to be away from the mighty dollar? Now it couldn't be more centralized, more political. And the way I look at it is, again, I think, and Luke Groman made a brilliant analogy of this in the 1970s. This is not a conspiracy theory. OPEC got together with Kissinger and his crew and they said, look, we're going to inflate oil. We're going to inflate it by hundreds of percentage points. It's dollar backed with the petrodollar now. It's going to draw attention into the oil trade. It's going to help us pay down some of our post-Vietnam debts. And to me, it's very coincidental that we're inflating Bitcoin now politically, draw attention to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin and Ripple are a pair trade. You can trade between Bitcoin and Ripple. The higher the Bitcoin price, the higher the interest in Ripple. So I'm not saying Bitcoin's stupid, Bitcoin's going to die, Bitcoin's going to zero. I'm saying Bitcoin's narrative of decentralized, anti-fiat, anti-government maverick, ironically, is the exact opposite of that. And that's typically how PSYOPs work or Intel programs work. You telegraph something as something blue when in fact it's a red pill. And that's a very cynical view, could be wrong, but I don't think it's a coincidence that you have former guys like Glenn Lilly, who was at the NSA, who created the Bitcoin deep hash programs in 2001. It's not a coincidence that Ripple came out before Bitcoin. To me, the dots are all connecting. Well, other than create interest in Tether and other stable coins that are backed by U.S. treasuries to absorb unloved treasuries, there is a genuine fear of the de-dollarization theme, the move away from the dollar that started when we weaponized it against Putin in 2022. And there is a concern about a quote-unquote arms race in CBDCs and who goes there first. When the IMF talked about CBDCs during the height of the COVID crisis, not a coincidence, by the way, every crisis is an opportunity to roll out something, again, sheep dipped in wolf's clothing, but it's really scarier than it looks. I mean, technically CBDC is just an e-dollar, an e-euro, an e-yen. It's not necessarily a threat to your dollar. It's just a digitalized version of it, you could argue. But that's more transparent, more efficient. All the warm and fuzzy things that the IMF and even Powell talked about 3 or 4 years ago. It wouldn't replace cash. It won't replace the privacy rights, etc. All those things. But what CBDC is something that is more transparent on both sides. They can see who's got what. They can see how to program it, and they can also see how to seize it, like we saw in Canada in an indirect form, how you could seize assets of truckers who were unhappy. So if you write the wrong article, say the wrong things, join the wrong group, CBDC technically could have the Fed or the U.S. government the power to take that away from you in a worst case scenario. That's the darker side of CBDC's efficiency and transparency and digitalization and modernization of all things. To your question, is it part of an arms race? All the major central banks and all the major economies of the world are looking at some version of it. And for Trump to say, we're not going there, he means it. We're not going to go there, but we're going to have Tether and we're going to have other equivalents, not in the centralized market of the central banks, but we're still going to be highly centralized by technology and highly centralized by that quote-unquote free market. Again, it's a magic trick. You keep them focused on the left hand while the right hand does something else. I don't know if Trump's doing that intentionally or knowingly. I think the people like Peter Thiel around him, I think guys like Glenn Lilly and Jeffrey Mann, who have been very open. Jeffrey Mann is someone who was at the NSA. He saw Bitcoin as something that was created in Langley. I don't know if that's true or not. Basically, he implied it's an Intel organization. It's an Intel-created widget to surveil the enemy. My concern, and I'm not tech savvy enough, my concern is that ultimately this digitalization and centralization in the private sector is just, again, a wolf in sheep's clothing. It still has the power to track and watch and survey and control the users of that.
Wow.
And that's the bottom line. And that's why my argument I made exactly 2 years ago, be careful of CBDCs or anything like it. Because despite all the efficiency, there is a darker narrative behind it. It's inherently complex. I mean, the entire ISO compliance operable distributed ledger is entirely complex. Like derivatives, it's meant to be complex so that you can't see what it's doing to you while it frog boils you into more centralization. I see it playing out in real time now. Yes, I'm cynical. I start with the premise that I don't trust the government. I don't trust the official narrative. If my premise is wrong, then I'm wrong. And I'm not saying I have inside knowledge from somebody in Langley. This is just what I think. The tariffs warned or threatened against the BRICS are just confirmation that the U.S. in general, not just Trump, is desperate and desperately concerned. That's the first thing. But I like to give two sides to every argument on the BRICS thing. And I've been talking about the BRICS for years. I'm obviously in the camp that de-dollarization and the threat of the BRICS is real. It's not overnight. It's not going to replace the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency. It's not going to destroy the dollar. It's not going to end the hegemony of the dollar in the sense, but it's certainly repricing and changing it. So it is a real force. It's almost half the population. Is 35% of global GDP. They have a huge amount of natural resources among them. There are many strengths in the BRICS that make them different than, say, Colombia, Mexico, or Canada with tariff threats. But I don't want to just say that Trump is afraid and he's stupid and these tariffs and these threats are useless. They're not. There is the argument that Trump, it's like, who is the bigger sucker? Trump famously said, we're not going to be the sucker to the BRICS. We're not going to let them get away with de-dollarizing, moving away from the mighty dollar. And there's great political optics in that, and there's strength in that. He's like Teddy Roosevelt, but then some. Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. Trump speaks loudly and carries a big stick. He has legitimate reasons for being angry at de-dollarization or moving away from the dollar. And I think one of the main reasons is he's seeing a massive offshoring of jobs. And this is the irony and the contradiction of Trump. He's got guys like the CEO of Apple at his inauguration or at Mar-a-Lago. When you look at Apple as an example, those iPhones are all made in China, like every other American dream is made in China. The head of Nike, billionaire, where does he make his shoes? Not in the U.S. John Deere, the great American tractor. I'm from the Midwest. That's Iowa. Where do they make their tractors? Mexico. Trump is legitimately upset that the American dream has been offshored. And so part of the reason he's making these tariff threats is to get CEOs that are in China or Mexico to get their butts back in the U.S. and make their tractors and iPhones in America. Who couldn't be for that? I'm for that. That's expensive, the reshoring. It's necessary. It's going to take more than 2 years. It's probably going to be inflationary. But for the long-term direction of America, it makes sense. Trump also sees a $300 billion trade deficit with the BRICS. He's legitimately upset about that. And finally, he sees a national security threat in places like China making computer chips for weapons that we could possibly use in a cold or hot war against China. So we need to bring this back. He's making Teddy Roosevelt big stick threats against the BRICS, and you can't mock him for that. He does feel like the U.S. has been a sucker. But then you have to look at it from the BRICS side, because they also feel like a huge sucker. They've had generations of importing U.S. inflation through Fed policy. When the Fed makes the dollar weak or strong, rates up or down, the balance sheet fatter or smaller, that affects the local currencies and local policies of every other country in the world. They are, and the BRICS in particular, are the dog being wagged by the tail of the Fed. In addition, those BRICS countries have spent generations having the IMF and the World Bank give them loans with lots of strings attached that are very usurious. And there's a great book by John Perkins called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Everyone should read that if they want to understand why the BRICS are sick of having the IMF or the World Bank give them generous loans. They're not generous. They're usurious and they're destructive. So they feel like the suckers from the IMF. They feel like suckers from the World Bank. They feel like suckers from the Fed. And most importantly, since 2022, when we weaponized a neutral reserve world currency against a major nuclear power, the R in BRICS, that they're going to react differently about the trustworthiness of this neutral reserve asset. So from the BRICS perspective, they're the suckers. From Trump's perspective, we're the suckers. And they're both right. And they both have to come up with a solution. And so it's more complicated than just making fun of Trump for his big stick policies. He actually is trying to make America great again. He means it. Whether that's sublime or ridiculous is to be determined. But you have to put yourself in his perspective. It makes sense. But he is a winner, not a leader. And as a winner, he sees everything as a zero-sum game. Winners and losers. He doesn't have that John Nash beautiful mind, let's cooperate. Because if he understood why the BRICS are moving away from the dollar, you can't blame them. If I were one of the leaders of a BRICS nation, I would see that. And so it's a lot more to it than just Trump is right or wrong or the BRICS are dangerous or not dangerous. But clearly from Trump's perspective, we're the suckers. But again, from the BRICS perspective, they're the suckers.